Good evening, everybody. Just want to take some time and we're going to dig into Psalm 105 tonight. So if you have a moment and you can turn there. Otherwise, I'm just going to read here in a moment. But Psalm 105. Oh, give thanks to the Lord. Call upon his name. Make known his deeds among the peoples. Sing to him. Sing psalms to him. Talk of all his wondrous works. Glory in his holy name. Let the hearts of those rejoice who seek the Lord. Seek the Lord and his strength. Seek his face evermore. Remember his marvelous works which he has done, his wonders and the judgments of his mouth. O seed of Abraham, his servant, you children of Jacob, his chosen ones. He is the Lord our God. His judgments are in all the earth. He remembers his covenant forever, the word which he commanded for 1,000 generations. The covenant which he made with Abraham, and his oath to Isaac, and confirmed it to Jacob for a statute. To Israel as an everlasting covenant, to you I will give the land of Canaan, as the allotment of your inheritance. When they were few in number, indeed very few, and strangers in it, when they went from one nation to another, from one kingdom to another people, he permitted no one to do them wrong. Yes, he rebuked kings for their sakes. Do not touch my anointed ones, and do my prophets no harm. Moreover, he called them for a famine in the land. He destroyed all the provisions of bread. He sent a man before them, Joseph, who was sold as a slave. They hurt his feet with fetters. He was laid in irons, until the time that his word came to pass. The word of the Lord tested him. The king sent and released him. The rulers of the people let him go free. He made him lord of his house and ruler of all his possessions, to bind his princes at his pleasure and to teach his elders wisdom. Israel also came into Egypt, and Jacob dwelt in the land of Ham. He increased his people greatly and made them stronger than their enemies. He turned their hearts to hate his people, to deal craftily with his servants. He sent Moses his servant, and Aaron whom he had chosen. They performed his signs among them, and wonders in the land of Ham. He sent darkness and made it dark, and they did not rebel against his word. He turned their waters into blood, and killed their fish. Their land abounded with frogs, even in the chambers of their kings. He spoke, and there came swarms of flies, and lice in all their territory. He gave them hail for rain, and flaming fire in their land. He struck their vines also, and their fig trees. He splintered the trees of their territory. He spoke, and locusts came, young locusts without number, and ate up all the vegetation in their land, and devoured the fruit of their ground. He also destroyed all the firstborn in their land, the first of all of their strength. He brought them out with silver and gold, and there was none feeble among his tribes. Egypt was glad when they departed, for the fear of them had fallen on him. He spread a cloud for a covering, and fire to give light in the night. The people asked, and he brought quail. He satisfied with them with the bread of heaven. He opened the rock, and the water gushed out. It ran in all the dry places like a river. For he remembered his holy promise, and Abraham his servant. He brought out his people with joy, his chosen ones with gladness. He gave them lands of the Gentiles, and they inherited the labor of the nations, that they might observe his statutes and keep his laws. Praise the Lord. Really, we can go back, and if we were to look at this psalm, we can see it also in 1 Chronicles chapter 16. The first 15 verses or so of this psalm are pretty close word for word with what's in 1 Chronicles. And the context of that says that this was sung, that David sung this when the ark had been rescued from the Philistines and brought into the tabernacle that he had set up. Parts of Psalm 106 and also Psalm 96 were also sung at that time. So it's not necessarily that this psalm was composed in that time, but it was definitely used in that time. And it even could have been that they used part of this and then later time either David or another psalmist expounded on that. and gave this the rest of what we have, other than the 15 verses. What it does do, especially after verse 15, is it tells of Israel's history. And it retells that. And it really focuses in that on God's faithfulness. And there is a link between this and Psalm 105, and then the next week when we'll look at Psalm 106. They are linked. 105 really does focus on his faithfulness. And then in 106, we'll see that it's focusing on people's unfaithfulness. So really, as we get into verses 1 through 4, it says, "Oh, give thanks to the Lord." We see the wholehearted praise of the event. All of the people were just filled with praise. And it was a very much a high note to start off this psalm with. And it's just enthusiastic praise for God. And he says, "Oh, give thanks." And then he continues with call on his name, or glory in his name, depending on some translations there. Acknowledge God for who he is, who he has revealed himself to be. And then continues with talk of all his wondrous works. Tell of everything that he has done. Wondrous works, both now, what God had done for them, and then what he focuses on here is what he's done in the past. We're to focus on all of his wondrous works, and not to just be to content on the past. It's easy for Israel to say, God did all this back then, God did all of this back then, but what has he done now? And he did them alone. He said they're his wondrous works. And then he should only get the glory in these things, shouldn't he? He is worthy of these things, and he should get the glory for them. Yet, even in the end of verse 3 and then into verse 4, let the hearts of those who rejoice seek the Lord. Seek the Lord and his strength. Seek his face evermore. See, they were to seek him because he wasn't done with these wondrous works. They weren't just a one-time event. They weren't all in the past. There was going to be more of them. And that's what they were to look for. He continues in verse 5 with that same idea in the next section of verses 5 to 11. Remember his works, marvelous works which he has done, his wonders and the judgments of his mouth. They're his works. Sometimes we can look at history, we can look at even biblical history, and attribute something to people who did this or people who did that. What the psalmist is saying here is that these are his works. Notice how many times in verse 5 all the way down through here, remember his marvelous works which he has done, his wonders and the judgments of his mouth, O seed of Abraham, his servant, you children of Jacob, his chosen one. He is the Lord our God. His judgments are in all the earth. It directly attributes everything in this psalm to God. And really, we could go through the whole psalm and just, if you wanted to, just look and count the number of times it's he or him or God, your. It's over and over again. And then verses 8 down through 11 really show why he did these things. He remembers his covenant forever, the word which he commanded for 1,000 generations. This was all in light of the fact of the promises that he had made to Israel. And it goes back to Abraham, that God made them to Abraham. Then it was carried on to Isaac, and then to Jacob. David was writing knowing that those promises, when he was speaking these things, these promises still existed, and they weren't expired by that point. With David, they were continuing, that God had promised to Abraham things that were still going to be taking place. And this was an everlasting covenant, verse 11. As the inheritance, not verse 11, back in verse 8, which he commanded for 1,000 generations. I don't think it was exactly 1,000. I think it was just a figment of David's speech in that sense, but it was everlasting. This covenant wasn't going to end. Verses 12 to 15, he looks on, and this promises started with a very small group saying, to you, I will give the land of Canaan as the allotment of your inheritance. That was the promise that was given to Abraham. carried on to Isaac, and then to Jacob. What a small setting. Abraham had no children at the time. Isaac then had 2 children. And then from there, it went through to Jacob, and then it started expanding from there. But this was a small sample size to start with. And yet, in all of this, God protected them. When they were few in number, verse 12, indeed very few, and strangers in it. See, they were strangers in the land, but yet enough to cause some caution. Because when they went from one nation to another, one kingdom to another people, he permitted no one to do them wrong. No one. Abraham, even in that time, if we were to go back and look at the Old Testament, and farther in the Old Testament, in Genesis, Abraham asked for trouble a lot. Multiple times, he put himself in a position where he could have been harmed, or his family could have been harmed. Isaac didn't learn anything from that, and he went and did the same thing. But yet, the human trouble caused by human disobedience, God still protected them. And it's clear here that he permitted no one to do them wrong. Yes, he rebuked kings for their sakes, saying, "Do not touch my anointed and do my prophets no harm." God was responsible for their protection because he promised what he promised to them, and that wasn't going to change even what they did. The next section again, and I know I'm kind of breezing through some of this, but there's a lot of history that we know, or history that we can read from Genesis, but this is just recollecting here. Verse 16, moreover, he called for a famine in the land. Notice, he called for this famine. That's hard for us to look at, and really the next few verses we see this. There's a lot of human trouble that God has called for. I can't say that Jacob or his children really asked for it. Maybe to a certain extent they did. But God still allowed this to happen. And even caused it. Because he was driving his people to Egypt. Verse 17, he sent a man before them, Joseph, who was sold as a slave. They hurt his feet with fetters, and he was laid in irons. Joseph faced a lot of trouble. And then verse 19, until that time, his word came to pass. The word of the Lord tested him. In essence, what is that saying? God was using these difficulties. God used them to test him. Even Potiphar's wife in that situation, out of Joseph's complete control, and yet God was using that to test him. All his plan for his purpose and even their good. Verse 23 down to 36 is a big chunk here who deals with their time in Egypt. And really, Israel needed Egypt to grow. That famine that God caused sent his people to Egypt. Because when God promised Abraham the land of Canaan, one family probably couldn't respond to that all that well. In the sense of, they couldn't fully take the whole land. One small family. When God brought them out of Egypt eventually, they were many, many people. He needed many, many people in his nation to fulfill the promise of them taking the entire land. One family certainly couldn't maintain, let alone protect, all of the promised land. They had, though, in spite of this slavery, become somewhat comfortable with being in Egypt. We see that even in their wilderness wanderings. They wanted to go back there. They were comfortable. And they, quite likely, they weren't going to leave Egypt unless God kind of forced them out, and that's what he did. Because it continues here, it says, and he made them stronger than their enemies. If they were stronger than their enemies, which Pharaoh knew, they didn't need to stay, per se, because they could have had their way, I suppose. But yet God turned Pharaoh's heart here against them. Verse 25, he turned their heart to hate his people, to deal craftily with his servants. God then started a series of events, which starts here in verse 28, 27, down through 36. All the series of events that we've become to know as the 10 plagues on Egypt. They're not fully in order. It goes all the way to the Passover, which is relevant to our time here in what we're celebrating this coming week. But God didn't give these plagues in order. Notice he started with, in essence, in verse 28, the ninth plague. He sent darkness and made it dark, that they did not rebel against his word. This was one that, the ninth plague really was the one that broke the Egyptian people's back, if you will. Because their chief god, and all of these plagues could be pointed towards a direct attack at the gods of the Egyptians. But their chief god was the god of Ra, who was the sun god. And really what this darkness did, the Egyptians were completely afraid of being in darkness. And yet this proved that Ra was no longer God. And in essence, the Ra that they knew was dead. God had greatest over that. Now Pharaoh still fought, hence the reason we had to have 10 plagues, or they faced 10 plagues. But the Egyptians people were ready for them to go. And Pharaoh fought, and then we ended up with the 10th plague. Again, note that in all of this, who was the focus? Even with all these plagues, which could easily be the focus, he spoke, he gave, he struck, he spoke, and he also destroyed. The focus here is entirely of God. He is pretty much in every verse throughout this entire psalm. Then he closes with 37:45. Because he brought them out. Verse 37. He brought them out with the silver and gold, and there was none feeble among his tribes. God broke the Egyptians, but yet he brought out Israel with no one feeble. They were fully supplied, well supplied, gold and silver and food and all those things. And they were at full strength. And he even provided for them on their way. Verse 40, he brought quail, he satisfied with the bread of heaven, the manna as we know it. Verse 41, he opened the rock and water gushed out. He provided for them all the way. And then, verse 44, he gave them the land of the Gentiles, or other translations say nations. Notice it's a plural. I think that's an idea there, the fact that when God gave them the land of Canaan, Canaan was a land of multiple independent nations. And he gave them that land. But yet, they inherited the labor of the nations. See, they didn't work for all this. They moved into houses that they didn't build. They had farms and lands that they didn't cultivate, but yet they moved in and inherited them. All of this God did. And we go back to that fact that he did this, he spoke this. Why? Verse 45, that they might observe his statutes and keep his laws. They were to observe and obey. They really, in order to obey fully the law that God had given them, or was going to give them, they needed to have independence. It wasn't something that they could necessarily do under someone else's jurisdiction in Egypt or anywhere else. They were now independent and could do what God called them to do because they didn't have any overlords, if you will. Now, God, the entire psalm here has shown that God has kept his promise. Now it's pointing forward to what we're going to see in the next chapter, was now for what were they going to do in response. So as we look to that tonight, how has God been faithful to us? We can look back and see what he's done in the past. We can also see what he's even doing now in spite of the disaster, if you will, that what we're dealing with right now. God is still on the throne. He's still being made much of. It's still about him. But we also need to continue what it says at the very beginning there and be those that seek him, because he's not done yet. He is still going to bless and be faithful because he's promised that he'd be faithful. He will never leave us or forsake us. We are never going to be alone, even though many times we feel alone. Are we looking for what God has done? We can look to the past. We know it's been done before. We know what he's done for others, maybe even for us. Maybe we have a story that's not quite like the Exodus, but we have a story of what God has done for us. What is he still going to do? Are we going to keep looking for that? And then we're left with this last little statement here of that they might observe and obey his laws. We'll look to that again next week, as I said, but what are we going to do? He's been faithful. Are we going to be faithful?